Hello and welcome to Books in the World. I am your host, Madeline Neely Holt, and I wanted to tell you that Books in the World is an interview show that has been produced by the Cape Cod Writers Center and the Cape Media Center. The Writers Center was established more than 60 years ago right here on the Cape by a group of dedicated people who were interested in exploring the world of writers, illustrators, publishers, editors, and others in the literary field, and how they played their roles in getting books published and out into the public. The Writers Center was sponsored 6 decades ago and sponsors a 4-day writers conference in the summer, brings people together and has classes of all kinds. And this show has been running since 1978, making it the longest running book talk show of its kind in the United States. So today we are delighted to welcome Linda Coombs. Hello, thank you for coming. And she's the author of Colonization and the Wampanoag Story, which is part of the Race to the Truth series. So before we talk about the book, which is going to be a real treat, and I have a lot of questions for Linda, and I think one of the goals of the book is to set the record straight in many ways, but also to share cultural knowledge that only people like Linda have a true grasp of, people in her world. Linda is a tribal historian. She is an Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe member. She lives in the Wampanoag community in Mashpee on Cape Cod. Having worked for many years in museums, at the Boston Children's Museum, Native American program for 11 years, the Plymouth Patuxet Museums in the Wampanoag Indigenous program, and at the Aquinnah Cultural Center for 9 years. So based on this experience, all this experience, and very interesting bibliography research, she pulls from oral tradition history, stories, cultural knowledge, and historical accounts that have been shared with you verbally from the Wampanoag and Eastern Woodland tribes. This book has received awards from the Library of Congress 2024 Great Reads for Kids in Massachusetts and the New England Independent Booksellers Association Books for Middle Grades. There's also recently been a controversy, so we have a lot to cover. This book was removed from Texas Library System's nonfiction section for children and put into fiction. And they then had a lot of pushback. We'll talk about that a little more. Fortunately, the decision was overturned and the book is back in the J whatever 91 something or other. I am a librarian, but I don't remember too much of the Dewey Decimal System at this point. So getting into this, Penguin Random House published this book in 2023 as part of its Race to the Truth series. The other books in the series are about the Chinese Americans, the Mexican Americans, and the African Americans. And the exciting thing about this series is that it's written by people with deep cultural roots in the culture that they're writing about. And as Linda and I were talking about, a lot of books are written by white people or other people about these histories, and as we were talking, I realized that I had misconceptions based on some of the things that I had read. So Race to the Truth is a good title. So tell us how you came to write this book, Linda, please.
Well, the Race to the Truth, which is the name of the series, I think that's based on a group called Race to Dinner, because that was a newly formed group in 2021, and they approached me in February of 21 to write a book about racism against Native Americans. and we had a little bit of a discussion. I was like, well, that's sort of a broad topic for me because my whole career has been focused on Wampanoag and like southern New England. So after discussing it, they were like, well, write about what you know. So I was like, okay, I'll just write about the history because there's enough racism for everybody to go around in the history. And that's what I did. And, you know, some of the pages are in white print on black in the book to separate it from, you know, the regular pages, which are black print on white. Because I wrote a story, and I had to create a story because I wanted to describe our traditional life. And there is no, what I consider, you know, good, you know, documented sources that really describe the fullness of our life. So I wrote what I've learned over 50 years of working in museums and studying history, studying my own culture, talking to Wampanoag or any other Native people I've come across over the years that I've met. And I wrote the story starting in the spring and just going through the year with a 12-year-old girl as the lead character. Mm-hmm. Since it's for, you know, 7th grade level. Yeah. And because I always feel that before people can understand what colonization is and the impacts that it had on Indigenous people, that they should understand, have some understanding of what our traditional life was actually like.
Right.
You know, so they can see, you know, better understand the impacts that colonization had.
Before we get more into the book, I was interested in how your editor received this first story, since this is the Writer's Center, and a lot of people who watch this show are struggling with their manuscripts. So what happened when you wrote this story and gave it to your editor?
Yeah. Well, she was telling me that the story part was too long, because it was like half the manuscript. And I'm thinking, in my mind, I'm like, so? You know, it didn't matter to me, you know, and she wanted me to cut it back, and I'm like, I'm in my head, I'm like, I'm not going to cut it back because it's too important. Mm-hmm. And I had a 50,000 word limit, you know, and I came in at like 49 and change when all was said and done. But when I always thought that my story would be chapter 1,
okay,
you know, because it's pre-contact. Mm-hmm. Then we start with the 15th century and the doctrine of discovery and the Pilgrims coming over and all of that and coming forward to present day. And, you know, they just didn't see it like that at all. So when I got the manuscript back with their edits, they had broken the story up and taken what I call the history chapters, which is post-contact, and just, I swear to God, she just closed her eyes and they just sucked us anywhere. And I was, because when I got it back, I'm like, oh my goodness, what on earth have they done? It made no sense to me. It made no sense. The arrangement, you know, where they had inserted the history sections. And so I spent literally a day, you know, like 12 hours, like trying to fix that. And I had no choice but to leave the story broken up. Mm-hmm. And people have liked that. So I'm like, okay, you know, it's working, so okay.
Yeah.
But, you know, I just had to, you know, try to line things up so they made sense to me.
Right.
Because I'm like, my goodness, if it doesn't make sense to me, what's anyone else going to get out of it, you know?
Yeah, so let me just reiterate, because I enjoyed it the way it is now. I thought it was very, very interesting. The black pages are the characters that you created.
Right.
The children, the families.
Right.
The way of life. And we're going to talk more about some of those delicious things that they cooked. And then the white pages are the little more straightforward history. But jumping right into that, I happened to open the book, and at the end of the white pages sections, there is a page or two that says, let's think about this.
Right.
And then the very provocative questions. Now, did you write all of these questions?
Yes.
And this all more or less had to be done when you got the manuscript back, and then you were
Yeah,
making units out of it rather than
Yeah.
one story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because through all of my work, I've learned that people just have no real knowledge or understanding of this colonial period
Right.
and what was actually happening. They know all the mythology and the stereotypes in the first Thanksgiving and who was the president or whatever, but nothing about what was going on with indigenous people. And we were living through the impacts of colonization. And just lost my train of thought.
Well, going back to, it's easy for me to go back to the way the book starts and where
Yeah.
it goes. One of the most lovely things about the book, I thought, was learning about how much the Native people honored the land and the trees and the plants and the river life and sea life. And talk a little bit more about that and how there were ceremonies when people killed a rabbit or anything.
Right. Because, all life is made by the Creator, the same Creator that made us. And life is sacred because it was made by the Creator. And when we were made, at the time of creation, each type of being was given a set of what we call original instructions, how to live on this earth. And so everything else on the earth is trying its best to live according to their original instructions in spite of human activity. And humans are the only ones that aren't fulfilling our original instructions, which was to keep the earth as it was created. And we also learned how to take care of ourselves, to sustain ourselves, to feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, have clothing, medicine, housing, clothing, whatever, because we have to take. We have to kill for our own lives to continue, but there's a way to do it so you don't destroy everything in the process. And that's, people don't have the perception that our life had any sort of structure or organization, which that absolutely it did, based on the original instructions. Our traditional cultures just grew out of those, and were based on that. And that's how we lived for tens of thousands of years.
And one of the questions in those early chapters asks that very thing. The people who came over thought of the natives as uncivilized.
Right.
And your question is, does this sound uncivilized to you?
Right.
It's very straightforward.
Yeah.
Just mention the tobacco ceremonies, that everyone carried a pouch of tobacco. How did tobacco come to be a sacred, potent material?
Tobacco was one of 4 plants that have been with us since the time of creation, since this earth was created. And those are the 4 plants that we use in ceremony. And when you burn tobacco, the smoke carries your prayers up to the Creator. That's the significance of it,
I'll tell you, if I were a teacher in a classroom with this book, I think this would be great to work with. It's so interesting. Even if every child doesn't read every word, the teacher has the sections on the let's think about this section. One or 2 questions is probably going to keep everybody interested.
Yeah. Well, and I put the questions in there because, people can read the book, but you're reading right along and you're like, oh yeah, okay, this and that, and Doctrine of Discovery and Pilgrims and Explorers, whatever, laws, 17th century. And I know that as you're reading along, you just keep going, and from one thing to the next, you might not remember. So the let's think about these questions are meant to help people focus on certain points that I wanted to highlight.
Yeah.
That people just miss, that is so important to understanding, what happened in history.
You mentioned the Doctrine of Discovery several times already. Would you like to talk about that a bit?
The Doctrine of Discovery was a series of bulletins that were issued by the Vatican in the 15th century anyway. And there's one in particular by Pope Nicholas in 1452, almost transposed some numbers there.
Yeah.
1452, where he states that Christians can go into the lands of non-Christians and take the land, enslave the people, take the resources of the land, or even annihilate the people, if that's what it takes to get the resources of the land. Because people who were not Christians were not deemed to be human.
Yeah.
So it's okay to do whatever.
Not godly, maybe.
No,
right,
that's
not human.
not human. Yep.
This was part of the mindset of the Spanish explorers.
Right.
And the whole Southwest and Canada was conquered by people who felt that this was their right.
Yeah. Well, a boat pulled up here.
What?
A boat, the
A boat.
Mayflower, pulled up here.
Yeah.
And it was no different here than in the Southwest
Yeah.
or in Canada.
Right.
You know, this is a point of first contact, Plymouth, anyway.
Yeah.
So.
There have been some apologies issued by the Vatican on this subject, and this Pope Francis is probably the most liberal pope we've ever had in our lifetime. So he has a brain and a soul and a spirit. He's very concerned about the poor, and so anyway, he has tried to say this was never a good idea. It wasn't right, but here we are.
Yeah.
So.
Well, there are several Native American authors who talk about, the doctrine of discovery, the concepts that it embodies, being part of the entire body of law in the United States. So even if the Pope did make an apology, the effects of it are ongoing,
Right.
because they're still embedded in the system of law.
Right.
So.
You mentioned that when the people stepped off the Mayflower, the way popular misconception is that there wasn't anybody here. And in your book, there are two very important ideas. One is the information about the Great Dying, about the plague, and the other is that you describe how many people were actually here. Would you kind of have some of those numbers handy?
Well, I'll use the word nation, even though I'm not exactly sure it's accurate, but the Wampanoag Nation, if you will, was comprised of 69 villages prior to contact. And those villages ranged from the Merrimack River, north of Gloucester, Mass, over to the Concord, which is just west of Lowell. And if you kind of curve south, the two rivers don't connect at that point, but you'll hit the Blackstone River, which runs into Narragansett Bay, then the Cape and the Islands. So that entire area was Wampanoag territory with those 69 villages. And the Great Dying, this plague, came south from Maine and affected 4 different tribes, including the Wampanoag, as it, barreled down the coast. And we lost, because we estimate that there were 1,000 people per village. So roughly 70,000 people. That's what I was basing my figures on in the book.
Okay.
And they're not solid because we don't really know. Those are just educated, guesses, okay? But we know that there was a 75 to 90% death rate from that plague. And so I just used 80%. It's sort of in the middle. It's a round number. And 80% of 70 is 56,000. Because I wanted to put some meat on the bones. Because you say, oh, they lost tens of thousands of people. And that's kind of, people go, oh, it's a big number, but it's kind of vague.
Yeah.
But so I made it very specific. So people can understand, because I've had conversations with people at Plymouth, and you're talking about how many people died in this plague, Native people, and people just, it's like they couldn't comprehend. They'd look at me and go, wasn't it terrible that 50 English people died over the first winter? And I'm like,
Yeah, well, that was...
well, it wasn't a good thing, but I was just talking about 50,000 people died, and it's like,
I don't think people quite grasp it.
Right.
And the other thing that you said was, well, first of all, how many towns were there on the Cape? More or less, 10, 20.
10-ish.
10-ish, 16, I don't remembering that.
Yeah.
And that each one of these villages, and you give a description of how the buildings that they had, the different structures, how big
Yeah.
they were, how many people
Right.
lived in them. And I think you said something like between 50 and 70 acres per, no, that's about how much land is needed for a cow, maybe. No, the villages, sorry, I have it right in my notes, 50 to 75 square miles per village.
All right.
And the impressions that we had that the Pilgrims stepped on shore and saw nothing that's what, I mean, you make a much more clearer picture about what they might have seen.
Yeah. They when they got off the boat, I mean, it was post-plague, very recently post-plague, so they weren't seeing a lot of people. Plus, it was December. We didn't live near the ocean. We moved inland, even though that might mean only a mile or so inland. Like if you're at the Plymouth waterfront where the Mayflower came in, if you go a mile up the road to where the public library is, that is the site of a winter village. And in those days, that hillside would have been forested. They moved back away from the coast where it was more protected. And any survivors would have been living there, but Patuxet, which is now Plymouth, was one of the villages that was just wiped out. As far as we know, the only survivor was Squanto.
Yes.
And there's some mention to some people from Patuxet leaving that area and moving in with people in other villages because they managed to survive the plague.
Right.
So,
if people don't know, the story of Squanto is also in this book, and you cover slavery, the capturing of various people, and how many years did they live in England?
Squanto lived over there for 5 years.
Okay.
He was captured in 1614 and was returned in 19. And when he came back to Patuxet, he came back to the complete devastation of his home. There was just nothing left, There was a man from Aquina, Epinau, who was captured in 1611, and he came back in 14. So he's gone for 3 years. So it just depended. They're the only two people that we know that ever made it back. So.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left for our conversation. I keep thinking of some of the things that I enjoyed, learned, that touched me. The Squanto story was one of them. The story about the developing of the praying towns, that is a very interesting piece of history that I don't know how common that is. Can you just sum that up in a few words?
Religion, or Christianity in this case, was a weapon of colonization. And people literally had to convert or die. Those who converted were the good Indians. Those who wanted to remain living in a traditional manner were the bad Indians. So a lot of times people would take on, at least like the cloak of Christianity, as a means of survival, And people were organized into these praying towns, On Martha's Vineyard in Takami, which is now West Tisbury, the sachem there set aside like a square mile of land to become a Christian town, as it's called, for the praying Indians over there,
And you mentioned that a lot of cultural things that the natives did, they had to hide, and that some of them became ashamed of those practices, or they thought they should be ashamed of those practices.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's affected natives in other areas of the country very much so. I mentioned to you that I had traveled in New Mexico, and I've heard similar stories there as well. And drumming was prohibited. Is that in your book, or did I get that from
No. There's a point where I'm discussing the colonial laws, and I mentioned the 7 laws that were specific to Indian people. And one of them is that there would be no powwowing.
Okay.
Now, the word powwow, from which the word powwow comes today, which is, the big dance celebration, whatever. But a powwow, that means healer. That was our medicine person or medicine people. And the term came to be used if anyone was doing any sort of ceremony or, healing or anything like that. And it became outlawed to do that.
And drumming is the beating
Including-
heart of Mother Earth.
Right. Yeah.
I enjoy learning these things. Thank you so much. We only have a few minutes left. Do you want to talk about the controversy in Texas?
Oh. Yeah, I almost feel like I learned about it kind of a little bit under the radar, because I got an email from a friend of mine who had been contacted by Debbie Reese from the American Indians and Children's Literature website that this boycott against my book had happened. It was taken off of the nonfiction children's shelf and put on an adult shelf. So it wasn't banned like completely. It was just reclassified.
It was put into the fiction section.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
and it was
in
just
the adults.
reclassified as that.
Okay.
And it's the Library of Congress who makes the decisions about books, whether they're fiction, nonfiction, whatever,
Right.
and not a small group in Texas or anywhere. And it caused such a uproar, like nationwide. I mean, I even heard from people from England, and that
You have heard
yeah.
from people in England.
Yeah, someone from the BBC wanted to interview me, but that never happened because the book got put back in the children's nonfiction section. So it was like a big balloon that just deflated when that happened. Nobody wanted to talk to me anymore.
Well, it hasn't happened since. I'm sorry to say that we are out of time. I want to encourage people to read this book. They are available in the local library systems. 50, 60, 80 copies of them are around, and you can get them. Go to the bookstore, buy it, order it online. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more, if you've enjoyed this interview and like to see it on video, the links will be on our website, capecodwritercenter.org, through our Facebook page and on YouTube. And I want to thank you very much for watching Books in the World, and I want to thank you for coming, and thank you for writing this book.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's worth some time to spend with this book.
Thank you.
So, we should be done. We should hear the music at some point, or they will edit us.